Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Transitions to Democracy. I hope that you're just great. I'm a little under the weather, but I'm feeling better after my first lecture just a moment ago. And I'm ready to join you tonight to discuss the social determinants of democratization. And this begins our discussion of different sets of factors or causes of democratization. Now, we've already like discussed in broad terms the different approaches. Now we're going to take a look at different factors from the perspective of social, economic, international, and then institutional considerations. And so this is really the beginning of an analysis that we'll conduct through a series of case studies and through different questions and debates that get us thinking about different perspectives. And what I want to encourage you to do as we get started today is really engage and really be thinking about our knowledge from the course, because we'll be incorporating and using that knowledge as we go along. And in particular, we'll be thinking about case study methods and how to test hypotheses with data from individual cases. And so this involves you, it involves me, and we'll work together to really have a vibrant discussion. Now, before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping. I'm going to be sending you a review guide for the midterm exam, which takes place on Wednesday of next week. I'll be sending this to you tomorrow. That's the plan. This review guide will contain a set of vocabulary as well as a set of topics for review. The midterm exam itself will take place during lecture hours and will consist of a set of concepts for definition, in an example if it's appropriate, and then one essay question. It's not going to be overburdening. I'm well aware of the time constraint, and I plan to give you something that's manageable and that will be a useful first assignment in this course. But this does begin with the study guide that I'll send you tomorrow. And so you can look for that. And I look forward to any questions or comments you may have. Bernie says hi. Hi. Say hello to everyone in class. You're interrupting. Just be cute and say hi. He makes me feel better when I'm sick, and I'm so happy he's here with me. Let's continue. You know what? Let's just hang out and see if he wants to spend his time with us. So look for the review guide tomorrow and use me as a resource as you prepare for the exam. Okay. The social determinants of democratization is our topic today. And the vantage point and the starting point for this discussion is this age-old argument that democracy can only take root in fertile soil. The idea is that countries vary in their historical and their social circumstances, and that this is the soil. These are the conditions that they inherit from earlier generations. These are the circumstances that they find and that they inherit and that serve as their heritage. And the idea is that countries are not created equal in terms of this heritage and whether it can support democracy. Some countries were always free. Some countries gained independence from former colonies only recently. These are radically different experiences, and the soil, as we'll sort of refer to it, relates to these kinds of differences. Some countries have a Christian legacy, while others have an Islamic or a Buddhist or a Hindu tradition. These are important differences in this discussion because scholars seem to agree that religious heritage has some role to play in supporting or kind of undermining democracy. Now, in this discussion, we're going to be thinking about how to grapple with these different kinds of arguments and whether these arguments imply that it's possible to bring about political change in the present when we're reckoning with the legacies of the past. And so this soil may be more or less hospitable, but how much we can change the soil from the perspective of these arguments really is in question. And this is the context that I want you to be keeping in mind as we get started and as we set off down this path. So this path gets us thinking about things like the Spanish colonial legacy in Argentina. Argentina is just one Latin American country. 18 countries in Latin America share either a Portuguese or a Spanish colonial legacy. And this legacy, you'll see, has been argued to be less than hospitable for democracy because of the kinds of institutions and values that those colonial powers left behind when they got rid of these colonies after independence wars resulted in their ouster. Now, Argentina is a democracy, but it hasn't always been a democracy. And how much of that record can be explained by the colonial legacy is one question, especially when humans live in the present and in the contemporary period and grapple with the problems that they confront on a day-to-day basis. Now, in some countries, people share the same language and ethnic background. In others, they are composed of a multitude of such groups. Some societies are very homogeneous, religiously and linguistically. Some societies are very heterogeneous and very fractionalized or very sort of diverse, if you will. Countries also vary in size. Some are small and some are large. All of these are considered social determinants. They are considered components of the soil, those characteristics that make a country more or less fertile or hospitable. And the question that we confront is, did these social and historically inherited circumstances affect the prospects for democratization during the third wave? That most recent wave of democratizations that is our focus in this course. This is our universe of cases, and this is what we'll be evaluating and examining to try to grapple with these different social determinants. And as we set out, we consider images like this one that depicts ethnic fractionalization in Ethiopia. Ethiopia is one African country among many that is very ethnically and linguistically and religiously heterogeneous. It's very, very diverse, and partly as a result of patterns of colonialism and the way in which borders were drawn relatively arbitrarily by colonial powers, who disregarded some of these differences and were primarily concerned with setting up institutions and boundaries that would help them to extract wealth and to concentrate power. But the ethnic fractionalization and the heritage of heterogeneity in Ethiopia is one sort of social determinant or characteristic that we consider important in this discussion about the social determinants. And Ethiopia is one case that we could examine and think about through these lenses. Now let's talk about some of these different determinants, in beginning with colonial legacy. This is probably by far the one that kind of looms the largest in the literature because so much has been attributed to the values and the institutions left behind by colonial powers. And it's been argued, first and foremost, that a British colonial legacy may cause democratization. The mechanism or the reason for this is because British colonialism usually involved setting up settler colonies and implanting liberal values and broad-based institutions that helped to disperse power and kind of create a pretext for liberal democratic government. And those institutions included like private property, representative assemblies. They didn't have slavery or forced labor. Now, obviously, in the United States, we know that they did import Black slaves, but settler colonies, by definition, didn't themselves rely on slavery in the same way that Spanish and Portuguese colonialism did. But these settler colonies in places that Britain colonized were said to be more supportive of democracy from the beginning because they involved institutions in arrangements that helped to disperse power and check the authority of the British monarch. Now, these were colonies. They were ruled by the king, but the presence of assemblies, the control of private property, these different institutions created a very different setting than, say, in Spanish America or Portuguese America, where a fundamentally different set of institutions and values were imposed. In these places, they put in place state control of property, absolute monarchy without the possibility of representative assemblies. They used forced labor and slavery in mercantilist forms of extractive production that would channel that wealth back to the colony. And in general, the institutions did not disperse power in the same way. They concentrated power. And they also favored some groups and helped to sort of compound what were pre-existing ethnic and religious divisions. And so French and Spanish Portuguese colonial legacies worked very differently than, say, British colonial legacies. Now, there's the example of Togo, which is an example that we've discussed earlier in the course, but that is worth looking at more closely because of how it played out and how democracy has failed to sustain and sort of be promoted in Togo. So Togo is a former French colony that won independence in 1960. It briefly had a fragile parliamentary democratic regime at that time, but it fell to military rule shortly after. And today it remains a corrupt, military-backed autocracy. The question for us as scholars of democratic transitions would be, why did Togo's democracy fail? And why has autocracy persisted there? Well, the French colonial legacy explanation would say the former French colony of Togo never had values and institutions that could support democracy. The French left behind institutions that concentrated authority and power and divided groups and did not support private property, did not support participation in government. And as a result, this set of patterns never helped to create a foundation for democratic rule. It was always the case that the military or some powerful group who could seize power would step in and do so because the situation never favored democracy in the first place. That's the French colonial legacy explanation. Togo would be explained by those residues of French colonialism. That's the explanation, and that's how the argument would work. And so just to carry out the logic, those institutions and those values that concentrated power and deepened fractionalization made democratization unlikely and made it likely that autocracy would continue, and it did so in the form of a corrupt military-backed autocracy, eventually, and at the start, military rule, which created a foundation for sustained authoritarian rule in that country. Now, what's interesting is that if you go next door, you'll find the case of Benin, which, although it has descended back into authoritarianism today, was an example of a successful, sustained, relatively consolidated democracy for at least a decade or so. And the origin of the case of Benin couldn't be any more similar to that of Togo. Here's a country that also won independence in 1960, also fell to military rule after a brief run with a fragile parliamentary democratic regime, but where Togo stayed autocratic, Benin democratized in the 90s, and in the 90s and the 2000s saw a series of free and fair elections and peaceful transfers of power that helped to sustain very solid democratic fundamentals. Now, this makes Benin what we would call a deviant case. And a deviant case is a case that demonstrates a surprising value with reference to some extant theory. Now, The extant theory or argument is the argument emphasizing the French colonial legacy. And the case of Benin deviates from that expectation. And so we have a deviant case in the case of Benin, and it brings up an important question, which I want to put to you. Now we're going to go back and use our criteria for good theory in democratization studies. Those criteria are those that you see here. You'll recognize this from previous lectures. Now, with reference to the French colonial legacy theory of autocratization, what criterion of good theory does the Benin case violate? I'm going to give you a moment. I want to think about this. You can take the mic if you'd like to. You can use the chat if you'd like to. But let's do some thinking and respond to this question. Ishan, do you want to make a comment?
I'm not sure, but my educated guess would be the fact that the evidence doesn't support the French colonial legacy theory through the case of Benin. But also, I guess it could be the idea of temporality in that it wasn't explaining different transitions over the course of time. It might have been just focused on a particular set of democratic transitions.
And those are interesting points. I admit that that's not what I had that's not what I had down, but I think both of those arguments are valid because clearly the case of Benin violates the evidence criterion if the evidence doesn't support the theory. And then the case of temporality is interesting too because the case of Benin changed over time. And what Ishan's pointing out is the French colonial legacy is not sensitive enough to be able to explain those variations over time. It's very kind of primitive and blocky, and it doesn't seem to help us understand those nuances. Totally valid, but I admit that there's actually another category that I think it fits with, and there's another criterion that I think the Benin case shows or violates here. And does anyone want to make an additional point, or what else do we think might be relevant here? Interesting, Maria. Maria says maybe probabilistic nature. That's interesting because I think what you're pointing to here is that the colonial legacy is quite deterministic in that it doesn't leave a lot of space for creativity or for some nonlinear outcome. Maybe if you're in the river and it changes your trajectory. This is certainly valid. That's an interesting argument. I admit though that that's not the criterion that I had here in mind. Karen says, I think reversibility can be applied because Benin did fall to military rule, but then transitioned to democracy, where Togo was the opposite. Oh, good point, Karen. This is true because is it possible to explain the reversal of democracy in Benin through the colonial legacy argument? Not really, right? Because if development is a process that can go into reverse, like in Argentina, you can't really reverse the process of colonial legacy, that it's sort of the heritage that you're stuck with. That's an interesting argument. I admit that's not what I had down, but this is another valid interpretation. And I think that that's an interesting and creative point. And Karen, I think, taught us something here that I hadn't been thinking about. What other perspectives are there? Can you make any other arguments about how or what criterion might be at stake here? Can anyone make an argument for generality? Is there any way in which generality is violated by this example of Benin being a deviant case?
I could see generality. Well, you showed it already, but the idea that it's being shown to be false with these examples, therefore it's not a good theory because you can disprove it.
Yeah, as you all can see, I kind of had the most straightforward of the criteria listed here, which is the fact that according to the criterion of generality, a good theory must be true for all cases. Now, is that always, is there any theory in political science that's true for all cases? Maybe like one, but maybe not even one. But my point is a more general one, which is that this is clearly an example of a deviant case and one that does not support the theory. And the theory must be true for all cases and must be so general as to explain all real and all potential cases. The case of Benin shows that the colonial legacy theory is not supple enough and not flexible enough, and it just can't account for those examples of countries that were able to rise up and throw off the shackles of colonial legacies and to sort of escape their fate, if you will. Benin showed that there was no current that would prevent them from sort of dismissing and departing from that trajectory of extractive mercantilist colonial rule. And so Benin, of course, descended back into authoritarian rule, as you know, but that also complicates the theory for the reasons we discussed, because the theory can't explain that because it's not reversible in the sense that the colonial legacy is not a reversible process, and it doesn't work in a way that could help us to understand why a democracy would break down in the first place if it was already in place. But I don't want to get your hopes too down. The truth is that there are examples of very consolidated democracies in Africa, and it's not the case that all African countries were colonized by the French or Belgium or other extractive, mercantilist, absolute monarchical, tyrannical colonizing powers. Ghana is a vibrant democracy, and it's a former English colony. What you see here is the Queen presiding over some sort of assembly or some sort of meeting of leaders. But Ghana is an example of a vibrant democracy and one that is very well solidified and hasn't slipped and hasn't really deteriorated. And so there's a lot of variation out there, but this is an example of something that does seem to meet the expectations of the colonial legacy argument, which again is that the British colonies are going to be the ones that do better because they were settler colonies that dispersed authority and supported private property and helped to promote representative assemblies and participation in politics. And so Ghana is a good example of a case that does conform to the theory, but we can identify cases that don't conform to the theory. We're going to discuss the question of religious heritage, and this is where I hope that we can continue to engage and address arguments that, I'll be frank, are controversial, not just for their analytical implications, but because of the political implications and because of what it says or how it might kind of distinguish between different kinds of religious communities. And the most important dimension of all to this overall debate about religious heritage is the role of Islam. And most scholars agree that Islam is negatively related to democracy. Now, bear with me here because we're going to walk through this and take a look at the different ways that these two might be linked and how this apparent link can be explained. The truth is that we don't really agree on how to interpret this finding. How do you interpret it when Islam appears to be at the root of sustained authoritarian rule? Many have interpreted it very differently. So the first view is that anti-democratic effect is due to female subordination. The argument is that is Muslim societies tend to subordinate women, not necessarily for scriptural reasons, but for reasons that might be sociological or related to other factors, and that this subordination of women helps to sort of demoderate politics, and that the absence of women has the effect of kind of compounding the more extreme views of men. And so as you can see, this is a loaded interpretation, and it's one that is interesting in that it kind of skirts the scriptural components of Islam, and it addresses and engages questions about society and gender roles and other questions of patterns that appear in the Muslim world. Now, the second interpretation gets us even further away from people and society and groups and gender and sociology. And this interpretation focuses on wealth and oil wealth in particular. It says that, what these Muslim countries have in common actually is that not that they're Muslim, it's that they have a lot of oil wealth, and this causes the anti-democratic effect. This is an argument that sort of takes us even further afield and just departs from those sociological components even more forcefully. But the third is even more remote than the second. And that third interpretation is the idea that it's just the mere presence in North Africa and the Middle East that hinders democracy. And there's this great argument, this great article by Ava Bellin. It's called The Robustness of Authoritarianism in the Middle East. And Ava Bellin argues that the North African and Middle Eastern regions have in common that here's a set of regimes where they've devoted a substantial portion of their revenues to the military, to purchase the continued loyalty of the military. They have relied on extensive natural resource wealth in doing so, and they've retained large militaries. And the argument really focuses on the way in which authoritarian regimes and incumbent authoritarian governments have been able to concentrate power and strengthen parts of the state that are essential to defending the regime and that have been essential to committing loyalty to the regime. This is a very interesting argument because it suggests that there are some clustering dynamics and some clustering things going on among these North African and Middle Eastern countries. Now, when you consider the fact that there's already an established precedent for diffusion effects and for arguing that what happens in the neighborhood affects what happens internally and domestically, it's not difficult to accept this explanation. But what I want to emphasize to you is that these three interpretations are very, very different, and that these are competing interpretations. And notice that the second and the third views do not relate to aspects of Muslim societies at all. Oil wealth and presence in the Middle East or North Africa are not tied to Islam. They just aren't, clearly. But the question for us arises when we think about how to assess these different explanations, how to sort out these different apparent correlations between Islam and authoritarianism. We want to know if we take all of these explanations on an equal footing, how can we evaluate or arbitrate between them? This is the question for us as comparative political scientists and as students of comparative democratization studies. Oh, I don't want to give it away. Do you have any ideas? How can we test these different explanations?
One of the ways that you could test it is by using countries that are oil rich but not necessarily Muslim, for example, Venezuela. Another way you could do is test North African countries that aren't Muslim. For example, like Algeria, maybe? I don't know what North
An
African
interesting
country
idea.
are.
Yeah, interesting idea. That's definitely, those are two ways that you could do it. There are other ways too. So as Ishan points out, one way you could do it is you can look at, well, what kinds of regimes do other oil-rich countries have that aren't Muslim? in that maybe are inside or outside of North Africa and the Middle East. Interesting. What's another way we could do it? There are other ways.
I think what we can do is like look at countries that, you know, have the certain aspects that, you know, that correlates, like the oil wealth presence. Well, that not the presence, but like um people that live in the Middle East that are not Islamic, um, like how they like how they perceive everything and how they see their government.
Yeah. So, so Juan, I take your comment as like maybe we can look at Middle Eastern countries that aren't Muslim and see what type of regime they have and see if
Yeah.
they're also authoritarian or if they're
Or we're not like specifically like even then, like even countries that are around the Middle East, we can look at them and notice how they run and how they, how they have in like how they have grown and what they have done to become what they are, like established countries around them.
Of course, yeah. And so, in a more general sense, we could kind of try to find those patterns of the values on these variables that we think might have a role, and we could see if the regimes correspond the way that we expect them to based on the arguments. And those countries can be inside or outside of the Middle East and North Africa, and we might learn a great deal from just other Central African countries, maybe, for example. We can broaden the analysis. Does that sound about right, Juan?
Yes.
Absolutely. So, can we think of other ways of testing this? What I want you all to see from this discussion is that there's a lot of different ways that we can assess this question using comparative methods. And the creativity involved is one of the funnest parts. Everyone will look at this problem a little bit differently, and those different tests that we come up with are all equally valid. Joel says you could find how another situation which is similar to the state in question and how other variables might affect the government. Samantha says, could we see how the World War II Cold War has affected the differences in this region? Absolutely. And we could learn about whether there are historical factors that lie outside of religion that might have influenced these things. And I think that you're onto something, Samantha, if you're suggesting that, this perspective might be short-sighted and there could be this other variable that they have in common and that other countries would have in common that might explain the outcome. This is good. We're really thinking about this. And what I want you to know is that there are different ways of doing this. And the one way that I want to teach you today relates to what we call a crucial case. Now, we'll get to that concept here in a moment. But the question, remember, is how can we test these three explanations of the apparent link between Islam and authoritarianism in a single case? Now, I added something here. I added in a single case. And this is what gets us to what I'll teach you with regard to a crucial case. But from this perspective, from the perspective of this methodological approach, we have to identify a single case that allows us to arbitrate between the three competing explanations. Now, one way of doing that is to find a Muslim country that is not in the Middle East and that does not possess vast oil wealth. And then we ask ourselves, is that Muslim country that is not in the Middle East and that does not possess vast oil wealth a democratic regime, or is it an authoritarian regime? Now, before we continue, I want to ask you, can you think of any such case? and it's not a trick question, they do exist, but can you think of a case that would meet these criteria and that would allow us to assess these three different explanations and arbitrate between them?
Indonesia?
Ah, Indonesia. Arturo says Indonesia. And Arturo said that a moment ago in the chat, and Arturo is correct. Albania, I think that Albania would be one too, John. Yeah, but I don't know the Eastern European cases as well. And so I can't say with certainty, and I don't want to be quoted on that because I might be wrong, but I think you're right. Bangladesh, yes, that would be one too, Edwin. Good, good. Turkey, yeah, it is a Muslim country. It is. And it's, it's sort of in Southern Europe, but there's a debate about whether it's part of Southern Europe or the Middle East. And it's kind of viewed differently from different communities, and there's a debate about that. Turkey might not be as strong a case to examine because of that link with the Middle East, but we could look at it. Armenia, Jose, yeah, we could. Like Turkey, it would be a relevant case. I think that Armenia would be a good case. I don't know Armenia well enough to say with certainty, but I'm pretty sure it would be. But as you can all see, there are different cases that would meet these criteria and that would help us to arbitrate between these explanations. And so one of those cases is Indonesia. Now, Indonesia has the advantage of being the single largest Muslim country in the world. Okay, so this is not an outlier. This is not, a sort of rare case of a Muslim country. This is, in some respect, the Muslim country. It's not in the Middle East or North Africa. It's far, far away. It's in Asia. And it's not oil rich. Okay. Now, the question then is, what type of political regime is Indonesia? And this is where we use our measures of democracy and our internet sources to try to answer this question. The question now falls to you. What type of political regime is Indonesia? And I want to give you an opportunity to use internet sources to look up this question up and to answer this question. And again, I want you to use those democracy measures. In the meantime, I'll add that John says Armenia is majority Christian. Yeah, John, that was what I thought. I wasn't sure about Armenia, so I didn't speak much on it. Jose says it used to be Muslim. I can't speak about those changes, but I'll defer to Jose and John on that issue. But yeah, but what do you all say about Indonesia? Is it a democracy or is it an authoritarian regime? So Ishan has looked this up, and 61 partly free according to Freedom House, 9 on polity. So polity would categorize it as so 9 on polity, Ishan, would mean it is what according to polity, by the way. Partly free according to Freedom House would sort of be like a semi-democracy, but Gustavo says democracy. Jose says it can be considered a democracy. Juan says it's a democracy. It is. It's a democracy. And this is an important point. And though this may seem simple, and though it may seem obvious to you, this is an essential point because it shows that it's a false hypothesis. Islam is incompatible with democracy. Well, maybe in statistical evidence, it seems to be negatively correlated, but the hypothesis that it's simply incompatible is false. Indonesia is the single largest Muslim country in the world, and it is a consolidated democracy with a robust, competitive party system and contested elections. It wasn't always that way. It had its own brutal dictatorship, but it's been a democracy for decades now. And the Islamic or Muslim heritage doesn't appear to exert any countervailing force, against democracy. And so at least from the point of view of democracy and the compatibility of Muslim societies with democracy, we can cast doubt on the argument that Islam is just fundamentally incompatible with democracy. Now, this may still leave open the question of how do we differentiate between those apparent relationships between those different variables. That's a question that we might need to leave to a statistical analysis or examining a larger set of data. But what I want to show you with this exercise is that we can figure these questions out for ourselves using comparative methods and testing hypotheses in carefully selected sets of cases. And not only that, but we can use single cases to test these hypotheses. And sometimes those single cases can be more powerful than ever. And in this instance, we used what we call a crucial case. And this is where we find a case that kind of identifies all of our different competing explanations and sort of isolates on key patterns across those explanations, and then helps us to sort out which explanation does the best job of explaining the case. And so Indonesia teaches us quite a bit. There's also, of course, the issue of social heterogeneity and ethnic or linguistic or religious fractionalization that comes often from colonialism and is theoretically and according to the arguments left behind by colonial powers like France and Portugal and Spain. But this ethnic and religious heterogeneity becomes important because it can hinder democratization according to this perspective. And the main mechanism, according to the literature that we discuss, is the way in which political elites, or political entrepreneurs as we call them, inflame ethnic passions or ethnic divisions in an effort to mobilize support for their candidacy. Now, what this means in practice is that politicians rile up ethnic communities and often turn them against each other or try to sort of differentiate between them, us and them, so as to shore up their support and to animate or kind of intensify their support so that they can win power. And what often happens is a process of outbidding among competing ethnic parties. And these ethnic parties are problematic in the first place because they kind of institutionalize these ethnic and religious and linguistic differences. These differences, again, sort of being holdovers, if you will, are kind of products of this kind of heritage that's often colonial and often the product of historical circumstances. So this outbidding really leads to this kind of bidding war, or this kind of arms race, if you will. And what we witness is the collapse of multi-ethnic coalitions, the breakdown of cooperation, and eventually, in many cases, political and electoral violence that has to be quelled by the military, or that might inspire military intervention or a hostile takeover or coups, and really the collapse of democratic institutions. And so this is another one of those social determinants or social factors that is linked to democratization. And the way in which this plays out is often different from case to case. But there are examples that are very troubling in that bring into question the capacity of fractionalized societies to support democracy. One student says, inflaming ethnic passion sounds a lot like blaming an ethnic group for stealing jobs. Sounds very familiar. Yeah, well, one pattern that we observe is that political elites often try to mobilize support along ethnic or sort of racial lines. And they often appeal to hostilities or tensions, or they try to paint differences between groups that can become beneficial for them if they rely disproportionately on support from certain racial groups. And yeah, so we can talk about a lot of examples, and this is not particular to just authoritarian societies or fragile democracies. This is increasingly observable in places in Europe, where far-right parties have won representation in legislatures and parliaments. It's increasingly observable in, you know, episodes and policy decisions that we would associate with xenophobic nationalism here in the United States, like barring entire nations of people from entering the country. These are all examples of, playing up or sort of inflaming these kinds of passions or these tensions in the name of trying to build electoral support. And so what's so problematic is that that's just fundamentally antithetical to democracy. If democracy relies on a certain degree of consensus or cooperation, and if it relies on equal participation, and if it doesn't rely on exclusion. And so democratic institutions are hopefully inclusive ones. And this kind of sort of outbidding and inflaming of ethnic passions is inconsistent with that, to say the least. One example that stands out in recent memory is the case of Kenya. In Kenya, the 2007 election was highly disputed, and there were several irregularities in that election. And opposition leaders refused to accept the results. Now, this set off a dispute that triggered months of urban riots and intercommunal conflict that broke down along different ethnic lines. And when the dust settled, 1,200 people had been killed and 300,000 people had been displaced. Now, this is clearly an example of intercommunal violence linked with democratic elections or undemocratic elections that produce a contested result that is itself sort of a contributor to this ethnic tension and these explosions of ethnic violence. The case of Kenya is a case like some others that we've seen, but it's a particularly jarring case because of the intensity of the violence and just how sustained the urban riots and the conflict were. So here's an image from those tensions. There was a palpable degree of lawlessness that overtook relations at that time, and the election violence produced untold death and bloodshed along ethnic lines. And this again is argued to be a source of what makes it difficult to democratize in these societies that are often fractionalized. But again, the argument often links these fractions to colonial legacies. And the whole point is that it's a heritage or a legacy of ethnic division. It's not sort of just the way things are, it's something that's been inherited or brought into the present from the past. And it is a residue or a fragment or a kind of leftover from an earlier era. And this is often particularly frustrating because it, in some sense, leaves us feeling hopeless or unable to change the course of development of these kinds of places that are maybe stuck with these legacies. Arturo says it reminds me of Rwanda. Absolutely. And Rwanda is a case where Belgium was a merciless mercantilist colonizer that was heavily involved in setting up extractive institutions, favoring minority groups to keep the majority off balance, and to keep society divided in a way that would ultimately support continued rule and control by Belgium. And the case of Rwanda is an even more extreme case of communal violence. And while we don't talk about Rwanda in this class, it's a case that shows us that these kinds of tensions can become extremely consequential, and that not only do they potentially hinder democratization, but they can also beget genocide, which is what occurred in Rwanda. South Africa as well. Forgive me for forgetting, was South Africa colonized? I don't know enough about South Africa, and I'm just going to admit it. I can't really say enough about, clearly in South Africa, you had minority rule by a tiny white minority, and the ethnic division, the racial division that supported that was clearly a heritage of some kind. And I think that it's another example of the way in which colonial powers can favor minorities in order to divide a society. Britain colonized is being pointed out here. What's interesting is that South Africa, even if it was an example of like a settler colony, who were those representative institutions for? They clearly favored that white minority, and they disfavored the black majority, which is a huge majority, a super majority. And so even in cases of British colonialism, you can see that these fractionalizations, if you will, can be very real and can be so consequential as to divide societies and support apartheid and support slavery and all sorts of stuff. Arturo says even Somalia is another example. Somalia, unfortunately, is a collapsed or a failed state that was never really able to support democracy, much less a state. And so Somalia is an example of fractionalization, to be sure. And you could argue that the fractionalization is the cause of state failure in Somalia, because communal warlords often gain a lot of influence in those settings. And those are, of course, sort of distinguished based on ethnicity and communal belonging. And so, yeah, these are all examples. Cynthia says, South Africa was first colonized by Netherlands and then by Great Britain. Thank you, Cynthia. I didn't know that. And so that's interesting because that adds a level of detail that I didn't know. And I don't think a lot of us knew. And by the way, everyone, I want to encourage you to add your insights. If you know about these issues, please share it with us, because we learn from anything and everyone as we go along. Arturo asks, can Mexico be an example? You know, Arturo, I don't know if Mexico is an example because I don't know if it's as fractionalized. Clearly there are indigenous. I don't know if you're referring to differences between indigenous and non-indigenous in Mexico, but most Latin American countries have indigenous communities. And so how that affects fractionalization is often less clear because usually indigenous, frankly, are not well represented in democratic politics, with increasing exceptions in many South American countries, but I don't know if Mexico is an example. But there's also a twist, and this is quite a twist. Even though we can pick out cases where ethnic diversity seems to hinder democracy, there are actually also cases where ethnic diversity appears to bolster democratic transitions by enabling nationalist mobilization against an authoritarian regime. So think about it. Those same divisions that can make it difficult to consolidate or bring about democracy can also actually deepen cleavages and mobilize nations against each other if those cleavages break down along regime lines, regime and opposition. And so good examples come from Eastern European countries where in places like the Ukraine, excuse me, with the Orange Revolution, it essentially was a sort of breakdown along ethnic lines, regime and opposition. But I don't know enough about the case, and so I'm not going to pretend to know. But these examples are important because they show you that the precise causation or sort of nature of causation here is really in question. We don't know actually the real role of social heterogeneity. Does it work for or against democracy? And the question that I would put to you is, if ethnic diversity can both help or hurt democracy, does it have any net effect at all? Are we more or less confident in this explanation after learning that ethnic divisions can produce different outcomes depending on the case? Would we need to identify what third factor is at work in differentiating between those cases where ethnic diversity helps democratization and hinders democratization? What might that third factor be? And more generally, what does this do to our confidence in this variable? How much can we really attribute to social heterogeneity if anything and everything appears to be a potential consequence? Yeah, it's a question that we should ask. We might be skeptical. Daisy says third parties intervening. Yeah, so Daisy's suggesting that, look, we need to find out what is that third factor that explains why ethnic diversity can produce different outcomes depending upon the case. And I think that the third factor might be kind of what we identified already, whether or not the kind of ethnic cleavages that matter also correspond with the cleavage between the regime and the opposition, right? In which case nationalist mobilization could be possible. I think that's an interesting variable to consider. And if I were doing research on this, that would be what I would want to look into. A lot here, everyone. And as we've gone along, there's been an elephant in the room that we just simply have to address. And this is where we begin to get real. As you know, I like to get real from time to time and level with you. And that begins with acknowledging that these theories and arguments, they have analytical implications, but they also have political implications. And that political dimension is just as important as the analytical. And this is where we begin to think about action and the possible and the impossible and the universe of possibilities. And so the elephant in the room hovering over this discussion is the question of whether or not these heritage-based theories of regime outcomes leave room for human agency. Is there a locus of change in these theories? Remember that mediating between structure and agency is an important value and an important criterion when we evaluate theories of democratization. The question is, do these theories leave room for living, breathing humans like you and I to intervene in these trajectories to improve things now or change the trajectories imposed by inheritance or heritage? Is it possible for humans to be humans and to act in the present, in the now? Or do these theories foreclose those possibilities? This is what we've got to discuss. This is the political dimension of this discussion. And so I want to open it up and I want to hear from you. Do you think that these theories accommodate agency, or is that missing in this picture?
I think that one sentence really stands out throughout this lecture when you're discussing the role of human agency here. And you stated how not one theory can be true for all cases. So by acknowledging that fact alone, you give the role for human agency to determine some of these aspects. And we talked about, for example, theories of colonialism, and we disproved that with Togo. Theories of oil, you could talk about how the US is one of the top 10 oil, has the top 10 amounts barrels of oil in the world, and it's a democracy. So there's clearly counterexamples, as that key sentence has stated. Therefore, there's always going to be a role of human agency because no theory is 100% correct.
So then the question is, so what does that say about these heritage-based theories? You know, are they too constrictive? Because it seems like in pointing out these deviant cases, it seems like, as Ishan's suggesting, there simply has to be a role for agency. Because how else can those deviant cases arise? How else can they appear to refute or kind of depart from that colonial legacy or that socio kind of linguistic or ethnic legacy or heritage? And so what does that say then about these heritage-based theories? Are they adequate, or do they leave something to be desired?
I'm a bit confused. So what are we, like, as political scientists, are you attempting to, like, create one concrete theory for how democracies develop in these different countries? Because as a history major, we're taught that democracies arise from various factors, like just accidental events, sort of, and different political leaders intervening and playing their own roles, not that they fit into one specific like theory or category.
Yeah, so good question, Daisy. So there are some differences. History is much more sensitive to contingency and the combination of factors that produce outcomes and how that combination can vary. In political science, we're often engaged in debates about which factor seems more important. And really, what you see is that we debate whether or not there are certain factors that can explain more or more cases than some other factor. And so in this debate, what we're discussing is the merits of the human, the sort of heritage-based theories, the social constraints that emphasize historical and social factors that are inherited from the past. And so there's a debate about whether or not those types of theories can explain as many cases as we'd like them to explain. And we try to explain as much as we can with as little as possible. And so the question then becomes, in rushing to try to explain these outcomes with this single set of causes, are we missing part of the picture? Is there something else? And what I hear you suggesting is that there's obviously something else, right? There's contingency,
Yeah.
and there's choice, and there's autonomy and freedom. And there are other factors that intersect with those considerations that matter a great deal. And any historical process is complex in that way. I think that that's one difference between political science and history. And I think that your insight is really important here, which is that clearly there's a lot going on. And what you seem to be suggesting, and I would like to hear from you, is there kind of has to be a role for agency, right?
Yeah, well, right now, for a research class, we're actually learning what we just read about South Africa. So it was kind of confusing because they have different racial categories that were designed by the English, but even after apartheid ended, those racial categories were still in place and they impacted the political structure that was established after apartheid. So it's still like, even once the colonizers like don't hold any actual like real power, they still leave their influence in how new nations establish their own political structures.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's path dependence, and in those institutions that persist can exert all sorts of effects. And that's the advantage of history and using a historical approach. We are sensitive to many more factors that could have a role. And I personally use a historical method in my own research, and I like case studies and comparative historical analysis because it's sensitive to that kind of nuance. And as maybe you can tell, um, I'm skeptical that these heritage-based theories can explain everything. And I'm especially skeptical that they leave space for actual agency. And even though the structures do persist and do exert influence, like you point out, obviously human beings can act in real time to alter the course or influence the pattern in some way that really changes the outcome in an important way. And so this is like what we learn from history and why we study history. And this is what political science can learn from history. And this is why, as was pointed out in earlier discussions, the colonial arguments in particular that point back to colonialism exclusively really don't take these societies on their own terms and create an opportunity for them to develop themselves. They just assume that everything will just be reproduced from the first moment, and that everything will be a duplication of the colonial power and what they left behind. And that's also insulting, in addition to being incomplete as an actual picture of the process itself. And so the politics of this then means that we have to recognize the colonial legacies can be overturned, and that there are examples like Benin in others that can easily solidify a democracy despite a legacy that might seem inhospitable. And it's because of a role for individuals and groups and contingency and history in the way that it evolves in an unlinear way, a non-linear way. And so we learn a lot from history, and this discussion really means thinking about the bigger picture and the limits of focusing on just the historical process in terms of that original set of conditions. What do the rest of you all think? Is there room for agency here? Are we missing something? Or is it constrictive, and are we wanting something more when we use these approaches? We have a few minutes left, and I think we'd all benefit from hearing from some more people. If you have any idea at all or any comment, it would be much appreciated, and we'd like to hear from you. Yeah, so when we talk about human agency, we mean the ability of humans to act independently of structures or conventions or rules or institutions, to act according to their free will, to act in a way that pursues their agenda, or that is free from constraint. On the other hand, there's structure, which is those institutions and those constraints and those conventions that determine our behavior for us and radically restrict the options available to us. So we can think of these two alternatives, right? These two poles. There's structure that determines our behavior, and there's agency or free thought or independence or autonomy. So remember that the importance of this discussion relates to the mediation between structure and agency that we value and we consider a criterion of good theory. Remember that we value both of those things. Structure to some degree does determine our options, but there's also at least a role for the preferences that we form or the choices that we make. Jose said, I would say that there is some room for human agency, but it would be quashed by the structure of the regime. In addition, I think a locus of change may occur, but the individuals who pursue this must at least equal a regime's power. So Jose is pointing to the phenomenon of path dependence and how these paths that get set tend to reproduce themselves One way they do that is by concentrating the power of those who hold the power. And when certain paths get put in motion and certain arrangements get put in motion, like authoritarian regimes, they tend to create increasing returns for those who monopolize them. And so that means dictators get stronger, oppositions get weaker. And this can help to work against that human agency. And this is an interesting point because this actually suggests that maybe the logic of the argument might refute or negate a role for agency if the institutions that are put in place at that starting point really do reproduce themselves in the way that path dependence envisions them as doing. That's an interesting perspective that I hadn't thought about. Giovanni says, I think that these theories don't factor in the importance of social movements that are able to change the trajectory of the nation's heritage. Since you mentioned South Africa, I believe it was only after the majority Black population garnered enough international support and through the efforts of the African National Congress that meaningful reforms were made. That's exactly right, Giovanni. This is a situation that was overturned by that Black majority after they were able to obtain international support and momentum in some initial reforms within South Africa. And so that is an example of agency, because clearly, though those original institutions did favor that white minority, and though those institutions did reproduce that power imbalance, it's indisputable that social movements were critical in the case of South Africa, because only through those movements was apartheid one of those very, very destructive institutions. It was only through social movements that those arrangements were demolished. And social movements have to be agency. By definition, they are examples of agency. They are the expression of groups of people who consciously choose to resist the existing set of rules, the existing conventions, the existing policies. And in the case of South Africa, those were racist policies. And apartheid was a racist, deeply racist and horrible system, much like slavery in the United States and Jim Crow in the United States and the residue of Jim Crow today. But social movements are examples of agency. And I would ask you to think about the various examples of social movements that come up when we think about cases like not just South Africa, but the United States and others. Yoel says, well, human agency can definitely have a role, but that depends on how the structures are set up. A locus of change could all depend on the severity of the agency, be an armed struggle or a bargaining of elites, but even then bargaining can still have those shades of autocracy and shades of democracy. So Yoel is taking a really interesting perspective, which is that, look, all institutions reproduce themselves to some degree. Even after transitions to democracy, the former authoritarian elite will retain some influence or some advantages and some institutional prerogatives that reproduce their influence in the new system. This is path dependence. Even in those cases where social movements are essential to democratic transitions or reforms, we still see that residue in those fragments. And I think that those could be seen not just in South Africa, but here in the United States as well. And who would argue, for example, that Black Lives Matter doesn't address and seek to address some of the downstream consequences of centuries of subjugation. This is without doubt part of the story, even as we exist in a time where the actual formal institutions of racism have long gone by the wayside. Now, that's not to say that some rules and systems aren't still racist, but Jim Crow is a thing of the past in terms of its literal instantiation. Listen, everybody, we're out of time, but this was a nice conclusion to our discussion. I hope that you enjoyed the way that we used some case study methods to address some of these questions. I recognize that we covered a lot of territory here, but I hope that you saw the value in thinking about structure and agency and generality and evidence and how to test different apparent explanations of a link between two variables of importance like Islam and regime outcomes. This is the approach that we'll take. when we assess other types of explanations, and we'll do this a lot in this class from here on out. I look forward to seeing you on Wednesday, and I hope that you have a nice evening. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. You're free to go, and thank you very much for being here.